services. And yeah, between 2018 and 19, he served as ERGA's chair. So yeah, currently he's responsible for ERGA's external relations, and since 2020, so since this year, he's been leading ERGA's subgroup on disinformation. So yeah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. So just before we get started, I've got a bit of housekeeping to go through. So yeah, as I said, we'll be using slido.com for the Q&A moderation. Now, you can head over to slido.com and type in the event code 2290, and there you'll be able to submit your questions for Lubos. And yeah, if I just give you a couple of minutes to connect, and we can see, before beginning, that'd be great. So yeah, I'll give you some time. So it's worth noting that during the presentation, you'll be able to submit your questions, and then at the end, they're all aggregated. And yeah, we'll be able to go through them and answer them. Perfect.
Okay.
So I'll just give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the organization for having me here. It's an honor because we think in ERGA that this is really important work, and I think that the discussions around disinformation are extremely important, and especially now that we are thinking whether what to do with this in Europe, whether the code of practice is enough or we have to move somewhere else. So our assessment is a part of this, and I would really like to share our assessment and findings with you, and also would like to hear your feedback. And we can discuss then whether our recommendations are the way forward, or we can do something else. And we will continue to do this work, so everything I can gather from you will be used in our future, I can assure you. So this is our ERGA report. I will tell you something briefly about ERGA itself and why it has been involved in the assessment of the code of practice. And then I will turn to the findings and assessment that we've put into our report around the code of practice. And then I'll be talking briefly about recommendations that we are putting forward to the Commission and also the wider community about what to do with the code of practice and the fight against disinformation as such. Now, ERGA stands for European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Media Services. It took me some time to learn that by heart, so Lauren, it's not really a bad thing to meddle it a bit. It is an organization that is gathering media regulators from all the EU member states. Every member state has a representative there. It is an advisory body to the European Commission, so mainly it provides expertise to the EU Commission, but also it is there to exchange experience between our members and also to extend the cooperation, because as you very well known, the audiovisual media services are services that go beyond just national environment, and this international character really calls for greater cooperation of the regulators, and this is what ERGA is providing. Now, when we started to think about disinformation, of course, we were sensitive to the new developments, and in 2016, when it became increasingly clear that the disinformation has also an impact on national developments, and there were the elections in the United States, and of course the Brexit referendum. We decided to also took some interest into that. It took some to put some work into the problem of disinformation, and we started with gathering the experience that we had from the, so to say, old media environment, because many of the regulators were involved in the drafting and implementing and enforcement of rules on impartiality, accuracy, and the broadcasting and objectivity, for example. And of course, all the media regulators are involved heavily in monitoring the broadcasting and wider media impact during the elections. So all this experience we put together and put into the report that is called Internal Media Plurality in Audiovisual Media Services in the EU, Rules and Practices, and this was in 2018. And at the end of 2018, we've been tasked by the EU Commission in its action plan against disinformation with the assessment, or helping to assess and monitor the implementation of the code of practice, which has been signed by major platforms, Google, Twitter, and Facebook, and some other organizations just about a month before the action plan was unveiled. And we've been tasked to monitor its implementation. Now, just to say a few things about disinvestment and when we were involved, the problem, of course, is that we had to be certain and open about it. At the time when we've been tasked with this, no regulator in EU, no media regulator, had any competence over disinformation in digital environment, and very little competencies were there for the online environment and such. So we did this as a new kind of task, and of course we were not somehow implying that we have those competencies. We were just saying, okay, if we are the advisory body to the Commission, we can use our resources and our experience into this kind of in this new area, and try to do our best to assess the code of practice. From the beginning, we were critical about things that there are not clear KPIs in the code of practice. So we knew from the start that it will be hard to monitor it properly. And you will see today in my presentation that indeed we experienced a lot of problems in trying to monitor. But these informations can be used in the future, and I think this is where we are drawing the main recommendations and main lessons from our experience. So the code of practice is divided into 5 pillars with 15 concrete tasks for the platforms distributed in these 5 pillars. So the first pillar is scrutiny of ad placements, which means that there should be measures that will try to demonetize or try to make hard for various players to monetize disinformation. Then it is political advertisements and issue-based advertising, which as is quite clear on political advertisements. And issue-based advertising is an advertising that is not made by political actors, but have political impacts or political implications. Then it is integrity of services, which is saying about measures against gaming the systems by automated bots or otherwise. Then it is empowering consumers, which is basically about tools for consumers to understand why they are targeted by certain ads, and of course is connected deeply with the media literacy, and empowering the research community, which should be measures for the relations of the platforms with research community and with the fact checkers. Now, in the first phase of our monitoring, which began in the beginning of 2019, we were thinking about what we are able to do just in front of the EU elections, which took place in May 2019. And then we decided to focus on political ads and issue-based advertising, which have a very close connections to political campaigning and the elections themselves. And it was a good opportunity to do this because of the EU elections there, and the elections were taking place in all of the member states. So we could really monitor the impact in different environments. And what we did was to run the monitoring in 13 countries. You can see them on this map. You can see that we try to really have a diverse sample of the countries. So it's north, south, east, west, big countries, small countries. And we gathered our findings in the report that's been published in June 2019 after the elections. Now, briefly, what we were able to observe during that monitoring is that the archives that were supposed to be in place for the political advertising were in place for all the other platforms. We've been able to observe that they were evolving during our monitoring. So there were very little information at the start of the monitoring, and they were being filled throughout the exercise. Now, we've been also able to monitor that not all ads that we found in the countries where the monitoring was ran that we were able to observe on the ground, so to say, were also included in the archives. The information that were supposed to be provided for those advertisements were not always complete, and the labels, of course, that should accompany this advertisement not always accurate too. Now, issue-based advertising, which is one of the requirements that the measures also should concern issue-based advertising. This part of the code of practice are only implemented by Facebook. So Twitter and Google have not any measures directed to the issue-based advertisements, and they were not part of the archives that were provided by platforms. We were critical also about the situation in definitions for the political advertisement, predominantly political advertisement, but also connected elements. And this is not only critique for the platforms themselves. This also applies to the member state, because really in the EU, every member state has a different definition for these things. And if you are requiring the platforms to do something about it, I think it should be a way forward for all of us to try to harmonize these things, because then, if the definitions are different, the measures will be different and will be differently implemented. And what we observed was general lack of data. The only data that we had during that time were the data that's been provided by the platforms in the so-called self-assessment reports that's been issued by the platforms every month coming to the elections, and of course the data that we have been able to gather from the archives themselves, but no other data. Even we asked for them, were provided by the platforms. So then we had this experience from the first monitoring, and then we were thinking about what to do until the end of the year. And of course, there were other 4 pillars to monitor. Then we decided, we gathered all the information that we had, and we came to the conclusion that for the scrutiny of ad placements, we really have almost no data. For the second pillar, we had the data from the monitoring, from the first monitoring, but no additional data has been provided by the platforms. Then for the integrity of the services, there are data only provided by the platforms and only in aggregated form. It means that you have, in the best case scenario, you have data for all of the EU, for example, but you can't see the data for the countries themselves, and you can't say why, for example, if you are being provided by the data that such and such number of accounts were taken down, why was that? This kind of information were not provided. And for empowering consumers, there were data in the self-assessment reports, but very little beyond that. And the same things go for the relations with the researching community. So in the second phase, we decided to take different parts of the code of practice in a different way. For the scrutiny of ad placements, we ran 2 monitoring, so to say, in Germany and Italy. For the political ads, which were the focus of the first monitoring, we had additional monitoring in 3 countries that had elections, which was Poland, Hungary, and the UK. And we also did the monitoring for Germany, and this monitoring was based on the data taken from the EU elections themselves, because at that time Germany was not part of our monitoring. But thanks to the researchers, we had data from that time, so the monitoring was ran on that kind of data. For integrity services, again, only Germany and Italy. And for the last 2 pillars, empowering consumers and empowering the research community, we ran monitoring in 13 member states. Now, this monitoring was based on the data that were provided by the platforms in the self-assessment reports. But also, we're trying to gather the researchers, for example, fact checkers, and people involved in media literacy campaigns in the member states, and we're talking to them. We sent questionnaires to them and trying to gather some structured data from that. So we were assessing the implementation of the code of practice on that basis. Now, you can see here the resources. So it was national monitoring again, self-assessment reports, of course, additional data from platforms if they were provided by for example, answering our questionnaires. We did in November, for example, 2019, and then some external resources. For example, reports and other monitorings that we've been able to observe. So the findings and assessment. So I will go I will go through the various 5 pillars. Now, the scrutiny of ad placement. So policies are in place for the scrutiny of ad placement, but there are no client-specific monitoring in place, for example, which means that the advertisers can't see and understand where their ads are being placed, for example. And we also were able to find some advertising on disinformation websites, and not only disinformation websites, but clearly on the websites that we thought that the advertisers would not want to associate with. So again, we have to be really critical here, or at least frank with the fact that there's very little data in these findings, and the more transparency will be needed here. Now, political advertisements and issue-based advertising, again, there's limited data. It was very similar to the findings that we had in the first monitoring. Again, there were no all advertisement in the data sets, and we also the big problem of this is that when you are trying to assess what the portion of the digital political advertising in the archives, you would need a data set of all the ads on the platform, and this is not provided. And we repeatedly were trying to get that from the platforms and trying to find a proper structure for that. And of course, we have to be frank here again and say that this is not something that is required by the code of practice, but we're really trying to get the most data possible, and we will continue in talking with the platforms how to do that for the future. But for the time being and for the time of the report, we couldn't find more data on that. So we were only relying on the user kind of experience. So the people doing the monitoring in the various member states were looking at the platforms and trying to see the advertisements that were addressed to them. We were trying to verify whether they were part of the archives or not. And of course, we were able to find false positives and false negatives, both during the monitoring. So for the integrity of services, again, the policies are in place. We can verify that. But as I said, it's only aggregated data that we are getting from the platforms. So it is really hard to see what is actually happening on the member state level. And we were able to observe, thanks to the researchers, a major inauthentic activities in Germany on the Facebook. It was reported that for example, the political party that's at the end in the elections had only around 13% of the votes, was able to gather 85% of engagement. And there were some implications that it might be because of the bots and inauthentic behavior. We are still talking to Facebook about that because they are disputing these findings, and there will be a meeting with them in 2 weeks' time. So we will be following this, but this is the information that we've been able to gather throughout the monitoring. Now, empowering consumers. Again, policies are in place. There are labelings and links to additional info available for the users. There are tools like flagging tools for disinformation and some prioritization tools where for example, relevant news are being prioritized to the users. But we've been able to observe that these are really different or differently available in the countries. There are countries where you can't find those tools. There are countries where you can. And there were some fact-checking initiatives by the platforms. Facebook, I'll be talking about their relation with the fact-checkers later on, but the fact-checking initiatives meaning the tools that there are highlighting the fact-checking by the fact-checking organizations. And there were some media literacy campaigns for the consumers organized by the platforms. Again, very unevenly distributed. There are countries where those campaigns are on a good level. There are countries where they are non-existent. Empowering the research community. There is some funding of the projects, but this funding is very irregular. There are different relations to fact checkers. For example, Facebook has a contractual agreement with the fact checkers, although not in every EU member state. These things are developing and evolving, but to assess, and during the time of monitoring, there were a number of member states in the EU that does not have any fact checking or official fact checking for Facebook, for example. The Twitter and relations between Twitter and fact checkers is very unclear. There doesn't seem to be any structured kind of relations. Google have a different kind of relations. They're supporting fact checkers with tools, but again, these tools seem to be unevenly distributed in the member states, and also it is not very clear what are the criteria to whom those tools are distributed. There's very limited measurement of the impact. Again, if you don't have data, it's very hard to measure those things. And of course, and also the platforms are not providing the structured measurement of the impact of these tools. There are APIs that are provided to researchers. Facebook and Twitter have them. Google doesn't seem to have any API for this purpose. And when we are talking to researchers, of course, they've been very critical about their approach and access to the data from the platforms. And only Facebook has a big initiative with the researchers called Social Science One. At the time of the monitoring, the members of Social Science One were critical about access to the data and the problems they had in communication with Facebook. It changed a bit from when the monitoring was ended, because now we know that there's been a big data set provided to the researchers, but this was not in the time of the monitoring, so it is not part of the report. Now, the overall assessment. Now we have to say that the code of practice is really a unique and innovative tool. We don't know about anything similar anywhere in the world. And it is an important step forward toward fighting disinformation. Now, on the critical side, of course, we can say that the measures are too general. They are then implemented in a very different way by the platforms. And of course, we have to keep in mind that the platforms are different and their usage is different, and the profile of the users and the tools that they're providing are different. But still, we think that there should be some kind of uniformity when coming to the measures that are required from them to be implemented. And not every measure was implemented, as we observed, for example, very prominently in issue-based advertising, for example. This is a clear requirement of the code of practice, and it was not implemented by Twitter and Facebook and Google. Facebook has implemented issue-based advertising. There's a general lack of transparency. The data that are provided by the platforms are only self-verified by them. They are provided in aggregated manner, so it is very hard to go through them and get the real impact of the measures and the implementation of the measures in general. And lack of uniformity, as I've been saying, and of course, the important limitations currently is the limited scope of the code of practice, as is now only encompass 3 major platforms, which is Facebook, Google, and Twitter, but there are other platforms that should be part of such an arrangement. So what are our recommendations? Clearly, there has to be work on the definitions. Again, this is not only concern the platforms themselves, but also the member states and the legislations. The datasets should be provided and in an aggregated manner and in a way that the researchers and regulators can go through them and test them according to different criteria in order to really be able to assess the overall impact of the measures of the code of practice. And we think there should be guidelines for the code of practice, because when the measures are framed as generally as they are, we found that there should be some other guidelines and other additional interpretation of the rules in order to get clear outcomes. So this is about the current code of practice and how it functions now. If there should be an expansion of the code of practice, we are saying that there would be what would be really beneficial is to have greater harmonization of the implementation of those measures in different platforms. That it would be really good to have a requirement for the country-specific data and not only aggregated kind of data, and of course to the scope of the code be expanded to also imply other platforms than just the three that are signatories currently. Now, what to do beyond the code of practice? We think that the code of practice now is a sub-regulation tool, and as being said, it is really an important step forward. But what is really shown by our experience during the monitoring is that more structured kind of co-regulation would probably be beneficial. It means that the sub-regulatory part will be very well represented by the code of practice. But on the other hand, we should have some other rules that would look into the functioning of the overall system. And if it's not functioning, then could intervene, which is basically the principle of co-regulation. So on the one hand, we will have the code of practice, on the other, some kind of structure rules, and for that, the legislation would be needed. Now, what kind of legislation? Now, we are talking a lot about Digital Services Act, and we think that disinformation should be a part of this framework. But again, the Digital Services Act, it seems to be that the idea is to have a very high level kind of legislation. And disinformation problem and the proposed co-regulation should go into some level of detail. So we are proposing also have an additional legislation under the framework of DSA or under the umbrella of DSA that could have those things written in a proper legislation on an EU level. Now, what is next for ERGA in this? Of course, we will be supporting the European Commission whenever needed in the questions around the code of practice and disinformation in general. But we will work on data transparency. We will work with the platforms. We'll talk to the platforms on how to structure our relations in terms of gathering the data and what data could be provided and under what circumstances by the platforms. We are thinking about another monitoring, but this is really this can only be done if we have more data, because to do another monitoring like we did last year in the same amount of data would probably won't be something that would benefit anybody. So we will see what we get from the platforms and what will be the willingness in sharing in the terms of sharing of the data. Now we will put some work into definitions. We are already working on the report that will gather the definitions into legislation of the member states around disinformation, around elections, political advertising, and all those connected notions. And we hope that it will really help to have a more informative debate for the problem of the internal plurality in general going forward. And we will try to draft the guidelines, as we were hinting in one of our recommendations. We will put some work into that. It is really will be guidelines around fact-checking, around the relations with the researchers, around media literacy, for example, and of course around the relations between platforms and consumers. And these would include elements that we think should be in place for any relevant framework in fighting disinformation on digital platforms. And of course, we will try to have a close relationship with EDMO, which is the European Digital Media Observatory, which will start to function in the 1st of June. And this will gather researchers and fact checkers and will provide some structured kind of approach to data. We will see how it will function, but we see a great potential there. And of course, we will try to establish a working relationship with them. So this would be another one of our priorities. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and our debate.
Thank you very much, Lubos. So yeah, before I'm just going to share my screen and we can open the floor for questions. So yeah, I think we have some great questions. I was just reading through. Great. So for those who haven't joined yet, if you head over to slido.com and then type in 2290, you'll be able to submit your questions. So Lubos, we have the first question. Which are the highest regulatory standards in member states for online political ads? Yeah, is the Commission taking steps to identify potential EU policy standards?
Well, we haven't done that kind of measurement, so I can only say that the usual countries that have a big standard or high standard of media regulation have also a good standard of political advertising and rules around that. But we are trying to take stock of this really in the report on the definitions, as I said. And you can find really information around this in the Internal Media Plurality report that I talked about previously. And you can assess for yourself. We are not trying to make any chart of those. But I think the standards are pretty high in quite a number of states.
Great, thank you. So the political ad data reported by the platforms, what kind of format was it in, and what kind of info was provided on the data?
Well, there are different kind of approaches to this. One is the overall archives, for example, for political advertisements. That's been available for general population. And then there are APIs that are available to researchers, and they are really different for the platforms. And especially, we had a Facebook and Twitter providing APIs. And I'm not a researcher myself, but what I heard from researchers, there are always problems with finding everything that you want to find there. For example, you couldn't locate all the political advertising there. There were problems with structuring your findings. For example, for countries, the data again were always aggregated at some manner, and there were other limits to those APIs. So what we are saying is basically that at some point we probably would need a whole data set of the data that are on the platforms, not every time and in the real time, for example, but at least for some period of time, let's say, I don't know, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, depending on what we are looking for, and to have researchers and regulators to look through it and do the findings that they need to do in order to assess what needs to be assessed.
Okay, thank you. So next question. Yeah, this is probably one that's pressing. Which regulatory body, new or repurposed, would you see fit for overseeing and enforcing co-regulation? So this relates to, what position is there for ERGA?
Well, we are, of course, now we are advising the Commission, and we are pinpointing the thing that we think would be useful. I can imagine that ERGA, with a more structured kind of cooperation and more institutional support, for example, could be in that position. we already established our position during the monitoring in some way, but with proper legislation in place and proper rules in place, I think it can be enhanced. Of course, there are questions around a big EU-wide regulator that would not be, organization of various regulators from EU countries. That's always a possibility, but what we have to think about and take into account is that these things tend to be very country specific, country sensitive. So I think the combination of local regulators with some structured coordinating body as an overall as a umbrella kind of structure could be probably the best option.
Okay, thank you. So why do you think why would you recommend co-regulation and not full regulation?
Like normal regulation, right? Or
so why co-regulation and not full regulation?
Full regulation.
Full
Okay.
regulation,
Now
yes.
I understand. Thank you.
Sorry.
Well, because I think, and it's not only me, of course, we think that you need to balance two things here, and the one thing is that we are talking about things that are tightly connected to constitutional rights and fundamental rights. So we have to be very you need to tread lightly in those situations. On the one hand, on the other, there's a practical point where you need to think about how those platforms are actually working. And if you think about all kind of regulation, the kind of statutory regulation that we now have in many member states for broadcasting, you are regulating every single piece of content that is there, and the broadcaster is responsible for every single piece of content there. But and on the platforms, it's really not the platforms who are making the content and uploading the content. These are the users that are doing that. And we can think, many things about how algorithms and other kinds of operational instruments are helping the platform to influence that, but still, the uploading of the content is done by somebody else. And from practical point of view, the data that are being uploaded there are, extremely huge. And if you think how many people would you need for a regulator to have in order to be, able to go through every single content there, it's just unimaginable. So the two things that the platforms themselves are not having, entirely the control over the content that is there, and the sheer amount of data there are saying that okay, there needs to be systems overseen by the platform and measures implemented by the platforms themselves, and then you can have a regulator who can be looking at functioning of the systems and not to be taking or sanctioning or punishing the platforms for every single content that is illegal or disinformation or abusive or whatever, but is looking at those systems, and if those systems are implemented right, then okay, you can probably have some leeway with the platforms that not everything is taken down immediately after it's been uploaded and it's illegal.
So
if I can add one thing to this, we have a kind of precedence now here because of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. Now that it's been implemented, there is a regulation of video sharing platforms, and the approach to video sharing platforms is exactly this: that you are not, regulating every single piece of content, but only systematic, implementation of the measures. And I think this is the way forward. Of course, we need to see how this will be implemented and function in real life, but I think there's good potential there.
So would you say it's more, it's probably better to focus on the way in which content is distributed rather than the content itself?
Indeed, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we have the next question. Which aspects of the EU Code of Practice are likely to be addressed by the European Democracy Action Plan? Yeah, this is really interesting because there's not really much information out there.
Absolutely, and I don't have any additional information. So I think, all of the Code of Practice, or at least, as some kind of systematic look at that, should be part of that. And I kind of think that there could be some kind of hint toward legislation that might, do the statutory part of that co-regulation I've been talking about. That it could be part of that, of the document, but I don't have really any other insight there. So I'm just hoping and guessing as everybody.
Okay. We'll wait and see what happens in the next few months. So next question is, do you have any quantitative results? For example, compliance as a function of total readership, results on the number of ads and so on?
Unfortunately, no, because this is the problem, that if you don't have data for overall advertisement, for example, on the platform, you can't say what's the percentage of political advertisement if you don't have the whole data set of political advertisements, and compare it to the normal, so to say, advertising or commercial activity, and then you can look what's been not being labeled correctly, for example. You just don't have the percentage. So what we've been able to observe is just the thing that the user can see, and if I'm targeted by some kind of advertising that I think is political, and it's not labeled as such, and it's part of the archives, then we have written it down, and we had some results. But without proper transparency for the platforms, you can't have those quantitative data.
Okay. So with ERGA's upcoming guidelines, will civil society have a role in this process of creating guidelines?
We are planning to have discussions with researchers, for example, and fact-checkers with this report. So we will have webinars where we'll be inviting specifically researchers and fact-checkers to talk to us about our findings in the report and what they think that we got wrong, for example, or what could be done in the future. And this precisely will be the basis for the start of our work on the guidelines. So we definitely will be consulting many people there.
Okay, thank you. Next question. So you say that policies are in place, but did you have enough data to evaluate how effective these policies are? Isn't this about the result?
Yes, that's why it's written there. The policy is there. We can say that that they have written there into the terms of services, for example. And there's always then the problems that we experience there. So of course without proper data, again, you can't have an absolute certainty that these things are being implemented in the right way. And but in all of those instances, we've been able to observe at least some instances where the implementation was right. So even without the comprehensive data, we can say that not everything is working. And the great difficulty, of course, is and I think the one of the main outcomes of the report is that those things are not implemented evenly in every member state of the EU.
Yeah. Perfect. So yeah, Commission officials have dismissed bringing disinformation in the scope of the DSA because it isn't illegal content. How would you bring disinformation into the scope of the Digital Services Act?
I think again, as I said, I don't think that DSA is a good instrument for the whole implementation, or detailed implementation of the things around code of practice and disinformation in general. But I think there should be at least a hint to some self-regulatory or co-regulatory mode where disinformation could be addressed. So nothing deep. It just to mention that these things are part of the overall framework, and then have another legislation that could elaborate on that. But I think if DSA DSA mean different things to different people, I think, currently. But if we are looking at the thing holistically, and I think that the aim of the Commission is really holistic here, I think this information should be at least a small part of that, and it will create an umbrella for the actual legislation or detailed legislation to fill the gaps in there, or add other rules to the whole structure. And I think this could be done also with this information.
And we'll see what is covered by the European Democracy Action Plan as well.
Indeed.
Okay, so how can the Commission push the member states to tackle the issue of disinformation on democracy more seriously?
This is a good question. And actually, what we've been observing from the beginning is that, not every government in every member state is really unhappy with the current state of our environment regarding disinformation. Some politicians probably think that it benefits them to have this kind of unclear informational environment. But I think if you have a legislation, then of course the member states are incentivized strongly to do something, are even required to do something. And since the code of practice is only sub-regulatory kind of instrument, with co-regulation, you will have to have a proper legislation for the statutory kind of part of that co-regulatory arrangement. So you will have to have some kind of legislation, and then it is very probable that the national legislation should follow.
Okay, thank you. I see that we have a lot of questions still, so I would say now's the time to probably vote for other questions and maybe refrain from adding more questions, otherwise I don't think we'll be able to get through them all. So if I move on to the next question. Could US-EU cooperation on the Code of Practice be relevant?
Now that's an interesting question. Well, I tend to think that our work on Code of Practice and disinformation in general is followed also by our colleagues in US. Now, to what extent they would think that it could be beneficial to somehow connect to it, I really don't know and can't say. But I think in time, probably there will be the reflections to what we did here in Europe, also in the US, and probably at that time, at that point, there might be something, some connection more useful. But at the moment, I really can't say what's the kind of thinking in the US around this.
Okay, thank you. So next question is, were there any consequences or sanctions in place for the signatories for not implementing commitments or non-compliance with the code?
There are none. And this is what proper sub-regulation means, that there are no sanctions for that. But I think the sanction there, or at least the kind of tool that the Commission is relying on, is that if this is not working, then there will be some moves toward other forms of regulation. So I think this is the kind of very soft sanction there. But no, at the time there are no.
Okay, thank you. Could you say more about the report on definitions of political ads in different EU countries, including when you would expect to publish results?
Well, the results will be published at the end of the year or at the beginning of the next one, because that is how ERGA works. And yes, we will try to take stock of all the definitions there. And so it will be an outline of what currently is the state of the legislation in the member states. We will also try to take stock of the definitions that the platforms themselves are using, for example. And then we will try at least to hint toward the better future for it. So we'll not, hardly to try to harmonize these things in a hard way, so to say. But we will try to at least put some guidelines there, how this what could work actually. We are really trying to find a balanced way in this, because we are also conscious that not everybody will be happy of us telling them what to do. But I think this work needs to be done, so we will try to at least pinpoint to the elements that are important to have in those definitions.
Okay, thank you. So next question is, there's so much talk about co-regulation is coming. Where must it emerge, and what regulatory updates are needed to withstand the legal challenge from online platforms?
Well, it really depends on what field are we talking about. If we're talking about platforms in general, I think it also it makes sense to talk about co-regulation. And when you talk about co-regulation, you have to think about sub-regulatory kind of framework and what we call statutory kind of framework. A national state is always the state kind of authority, like media regulator, for example, being the state part of the co-regulation, and there is some kind of sub-regulatory body. On the EU level, you will have to have some kind of EU legislation to that, and you will have to have some kind of EU regulator, whether it is an organization of different regulators from different member states, or it is a self-standing kind of organization. It's not that important. Now, as I said, you have to have some kind of self-regulatory arrangement on the part of the platforms, or at least one platform. Normally, when you talk about self-regulation and co-regulation in the member states, it's always kind of industry-wide initiative that is there. Now, with the platforms, where we only have 3 platforms, it's really hard to imagine that all of them, will put together something. So, what I see as where is potential, for example, if we are talking about content moderation, we can be talking about the Facebook and its oversight board, and you can see, okay, this could be a good basis for a sub-regulatory framework, and then you have to have something that will connect to it on the EU level, for example, to have functioning co-regulation. So I think this is something that we can move toward. Of course, this is just I'm just scratching the surface here on this, but I think this could be the way where we can go.
Okay. Next question is: will ERGA advise EU bodies on media literacy campaigns?
The guidelines that we are planning is more of an advice to the platforms and how to have the campaigns more evenly distributed in the member states, for example, and how to capture more of the population, because we think that even there are some initiatives, the portion of the population that is captured by it is not that high. So this is one thing. On the other, for example, last year when there was a media literacy week, we've been talking with the Commission about media literacy in general, and we are really willing to help in any other way. And it's a common experience that media regulators are being quite often a part of media literacy campaign in the member states. So, for example, we had some talks also with the platforms on some kind of coordinated campaign here. So everybody's talking to everybody. I can't say that we will be directly talking to the Commission about some particular campaign, but the notion is on the table and we are part of that. So in a way, yes.
Okay. Second question, which probably relates to this one. Platforms' influence buying tactics have been widely reported. So how can ERGA ensure media literacy be kept independent from platforms' influence?
Well, good question. I think the very easy question and kind of tongue-in-cheek one would be we just need platforms' money, and the campaign could be done by somebody else. But this is not entirely true, because I think what is important in those campaigns is that the platforms are using their infrastructure to carry the message. So I don't think you can do this effectively without them being involved. But you can probably have an overseeing body or board or something like that will ensure that the influence would not be too damaging, or at least too much for the campaigns to be carried out in a proper way. We have a nice experience with a good campaign in Ireland, for example, where really many stakeholders were involved, including the major platforms. And the infrastructure of the platforms were crucial in the spread of the message and its overall impact, which has been very good. So I think these things are connected, so you can't do it without them, but you have to have measures or framework in place that their influence would be only helping, not damaging the campaign.
Thank you. So I'm afraid we're actually running out of time, so I believe we only have time for about 3 more questions. So I would encourage everyone to upvote for those that really want answering. So we move on to the next question. Given the context of COVID-19 disinformation, are there any issues highlighted by the report that have been amplified by the infodemic?
Well, I haven't experienced anything in that regard. What we can say is that the measures that are in the code of practice were implemented in a much harder way during the COVID crisis, and I think that this is an overall experience. Of course, we have to differentiate that the health information and disinformation around health could be much more damaging than political kind of disinformation, at least in the short term perspective. So I think the different approach is understandable, but there are many people saying that okay, the COVID-19 disinformation thing showed us that the platforms can be really effective in fighting disinformation. So there may be some lessons to take from this. But again, I'm really trying to explain to everybody that I think there's a great difference between life threatening disinformation and disinformation about political environment.
Yeah. Okay. So have you ever gotten the impression that either industry or politicians have tried to pressure you into more or less regulation?
Well, those things are happening, all the time. There are different, but it's not pressure. It's just different opinions on different things. So we are even within ERGA, between regulators themselves, there are those that would like to have more regulation and those that are pro softer kind of approach. So these things are normal. You get those questions all the time, and we are really trying to rely on our experience, on our research, and we are always aiming to strike the proper balance, because the fundamental rights there, the freedom of expression is always the limit. So we have to be careful there.
Sensitive, for sure. So we'll maybe have these two questions and then I think we'll wrap up. How would ERGA change or improve this exercise if it were asked to do it a second time? Not necessarily in terms of the code of practice, but in terms of coordinating / resourcing monitoring.
Well, we learned a ton, I have to say. So we are very prepared to do it now. I think many of the regulators now realized how important it is to have a research kind of departments. We will be using researchers some more if we need it to do this exercise, and we'll, as always, and I've said it many times, we need more transparency, so we would need some kind of structured access to data.
Thank you. And a last question, how will the emerging regulatory approach vis-a-vis the National Disinformation Observatories Network be shaped, and what can NGOs expect from the Commission?
Well, we'll have to see. I don't have any special insights here. I think that if we are talking about the European Digital Media Observatory, I think I see a great potential there. So I hope when there's one authority or one institution that is gathering inputs and can provide access to data in a kind of aggregated manner and in one place, I think it could help many NGOs and the overall purpose of why we're doing this. But what is real impact to the NGOs and what will change for them, I can't say at this moment.